The Bible says that the truth shall set you free, but often the casualties of truth-seeking are faculty members in religious higher education. What happens when a seminary professor's truth-seeking lands him to become a secular humanist? Professor Brandon Withrow discovered that he had to choose between his full-time faculty position and his conscience, leading him to leave his job behind. He blames curiosity, but he wouldn't change a thing. Brandon G. Withrow is an adjunct lecturer in religious studies at the University of Findlay, Ohio. He is editor at The Curious Ape, which can be found at thecuriousape.com. Brandon is also the author of 9 books. His most recent book is Consider No Evil: Two Faith Traditions and the Problem of Academic Freedom in Religious Higher Education, co-authored with Menachem Wecker. You can find Brandon on Twitter at @bwithrow. Brandon's story of becoming a secular humanist has even made the news in Britain. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Brandon Withrow.
Well, everything's going as planned. I thought I'd get here and then break your system first. And so I just have my slides up here on my cell phone so you can all easily see that. Yeah, zoom in a little. Yeah. So, how curiosity kills a seminary faculty position. It actually kills it pretty easily. And so what I'm going to do today actually is going to just talk about how I got to that place of leaving my position. I was assistant professor of the history of Christianity and religious studies at Weinberger Theological Seminary, director of the Master of Arts Theological Studies program there. So it was not an easy thing for me to do because literally this was my career direction. But it was something that eventually I came to and have written about pretty recently. So I'm going to talk about my time as life in the church. I was raised as a pastor's kid, converted at 4, baptized at 6, and so a whole life there. I'm going to talk about my life as a student, having been educated, and I went to for a while I went to a Baptist grade school. I've been to three evangelical institutions: Moody Bible Institute, Trinity International University at TEDS, which is the Divinity School, and at Westminster Theological Seminary, which is in Philadelphia. Have you heard of any of those schools? Okay. Moody is right in the middle of downtown. It's pretty conservative. At the time we were there, as students, both my wife and I were there. It was the kind where the women couldn't wear pants and couldn't hold hands, couldn't use playing cards because the devil, a few other things. But there was also a lot of good stuff that came out of that time. So Westminster was a pretty well-known place in the evangelical world. It is, I would say, also very conservative. It's Reformed and Presbyterian in its background. And then, of course, life as a professor. I've spent a lot of time teaching. In the last several years, I actually started teaching as a teaching assistant at Westminster, moved on to Beeson Divinity School and for a visiting stint there, and then on to Weinberger. And now I'm at the University of Findlay teaching religious studies there. So that's a brief overview, but what does that all have to do with curiosity? So I define curiosity as the inherent human drive to close gaps in knowledge, to know ourselves, and to explain the universe better. So curiosity to me is kind of close to the idea of wonder, whereas wonder sort of gets you to stop and notice something that you had not noticed before or had not really thought about. Curiosity then becomes that drive to explain it, to understand it. And then, of course, that is taken further by things like actually reading books and just sort of the overall investigation of life. Now, some people don't have a lot of curiosity. I've taught many of those people. And I think every human being has an element of curiosity. The people that we call incurious are, I think, well, this goes to the next thing, really. When is curiosity a problem? So I would say that curiosity is a problem, not so much in asking questions. This is the thing that I think sometimes tends to, at least, get some people a little concerned about religion, and in terms of, well, they don't like questions. Religious people are afraid of questions. And even ask somebody who was in the church. That is something I kind of thought for the longest time, until I became a professor. It turns out lots of people are not afraid of the questions. What they're afraid of are the answers. So as long as you have the right answer, the question's okay to ask. It's okay to be a doubting Thomas. It's okay to be a doubter in some form. But you aren't really supposed to stay there perpetually. And you aren't supposed to remain a sort of Christian skeptic. You're supposed to eventually resolve yourself on an answer. So I discovered that a lot of students are not afraid to actually ask questions. They're just afraid to find out what the answer is. So that is one of the things that will come up, I think, in terms of just what I'm talking about here is, for me, I have a life that was not as much of afraid of the answers themselves. But I have experienced some pretty strong roadblocks in the answers department. Not just for myself, but times where you talk about something on Facebook, research you're doing, these kinds of things, and a relative pops up, as they often do on Facebook, with an uninvited direction of some kind. One particular relative that I love deeply, but who was like, if any answer leads me away from Jesus, I will not accept it. So that to me sort of typifies that it's not the questions, it's the answers kind of a thing. And then, of course, what do you do when you investigate something and you find out that the answers are a problem for your theology? So you have a way of looking at the world. You have a worldview of some kind, whether it's really conservative or very liberal. You have a way of thinking about the origin of the universe. You have a way of thinking about the origins of life. You have a way of thinking about gender and sexuality and all this. And you start learning, and you have questions, and you start reading. And what if you're not the kind of person who can really just ignore the things that you're reading? And it sort of lingers with you. How do you address it when the things that you are looking at are actually interfering with your beliefs? Well, there's this sort of thing that I call building a better God. So you can think about this from the perspective of sort of ancient deities as a type of metaphor. But it's something like this. You have a wooden deity. Wooden deities are prone to things like fires, termites. So you build a marble deity. And that's really nice and strong, and it has long-lasting power until your enemies come in and smash it with a hammer. So then you decide to build a sort of omniscient, omnipresent, invisible, immortal God. Nobody can touch that. And that is an oversimplification. Nobody sits down really and exactly says, gee, this wooden deity could be better if it was marble, because then, I'm protecting my deity. It's not really so much that, as much as a metaphor, an allegory for belief. I think we tend to look at the things that the way we look at the world, we find things that interfere with that and call us to rethink our ideas. And then we use a little bit of dissonance reduction, confirmation bias, just selective evidence, these kinds of things, so that we can rework our theology. So you might go, as I did, from, say, being a young earth creationist as a kid, my teenage years especially, and then enter into college and start to really discover what evolution is. That it's not, as Glenn Beck said, a half monkey, half human thing that, which I always felt like it meant he never read a half book on evolution. But that it is actually more complicated than that. And so you start to, but you can't necessarily give up the idea of God either, right, at that point. But you're faced with this insurmountable evidence for something else. So you start to think about, well, could God be, say, overseeing evolution? Could God have been the one that started the Big Bang? Or could God have been responsible for this or for that? And you start to interject deity into the process as a way to sort of secure your faith, the thing that you love. while simultaneously, moving forward. So you have what would be progressive Christianity. Somebody that would be very much, if you walk out there and you talk to somebody who's a Christian in the main line, they would say, I don't have any problems with science. I engage scientific ideas all the time. I embrace the evidence for evolution. I embrace the Big Bang. I embrace this, embrace that, and in terms of LGBTQ issues, I mean, sure, why not? God loves everyone, and God wants people to love each other. So you can have a Christianity that's pretty progressive, pretty liberal, and for all intents and purposes, probably doesn't look all that different daily from the way you might live your own life as, say, a humanist. And yet still be deeply religious. And that is, I think, because you can constantly revise and constantly edit the DNA of your faith to sort of evolve it to meet the demands of a progressive modern society. Now, a lot of people can do that. Some people will resist it entirely. That tends to come up in the sort of Ken Ham world of Answers in Genesis, and that's the creationist world that you often hear people upset about, and that often gets the most attention. When you're going to build a giant ark, you tend to get a lot of attention. But honestly, that doesn't represent all the religious either. And I think it's important to know this because, as somebody who drifted through various denominations before I exited Christianity, there was all these points in which somebody could say something about my faith, and I could say, that's not my Christianity. I don't believe that. How many times have you looked at the comment sections on articles where, say, Bryan College, for example, who recently, within the last 2 years, instituted a creationist statement that their faculty had to sign on to. And you would find statements in the comments at Chronicle of Higher Ed and Inside Higher Ed, where people would say, I don't know why they're doing that to the faculty. Why do they have to be creationists? That's not my Christianity. So it's always a moving target, but it's always a moving target because people have ways to adapt and to integrate their faith into the modern world, which makes certain things really difficult. For one, I can get frustrated when I see things I don't like, and I really want to say blanket statements about just about the person in front of me that's frustrating. Like, why do Christians X? That's really difficult because it doesn't apply in all situations. And then you end up running into these problems. So my story itself in the higher education is one in which curiosity poked holes in my beliefs. I discovered that I and others could use creative thinking, which could be denial, or it could be a way of modifying or evolving my theology to fit. For me, it was most often trying to find a way to make my theology speak the language of science in that way. And I also often found that faith communities can be pretty strong reasons for people to resist change. So from my background, my father is a Baptist minister in just over the state line of Michigan. And that's the family church, this church I went to when I was a kid. I didn't come out to him until last year about my absence of faith. Now, he had an idea. And frankly, as I was moving along in my own progression there, we had a lot of breakfasts during the week where I would meet with him, and we'd talk about life stuff. And I would drop hints so that when the time came that he wouldn't feel like I hit him with a bag of bricks. And that actually went very well. But that was a strong motivator for me to find a way to stay in the faith while simultaneously, embracing new things. Eventually, though, you reach that tension point where either you're going to bounce back or you're going to snap. And for me, it was the snapping part, and that was the point in which I left my position. Now, here's the thing about seminaries. First, here's the thing about being a pastor's kid. There are high expectations of being a pastor's kid. Has anybody here been a pastor's kid? How many of you have been raised in the church at all? Okay, for more than 10 years? More than 15? More than 20? Okay, all right, so I got some almost lifers there. Yeah, so as a pastor's kid, first, you're expected to be the most moral person in the church as far as the kids go. So everybody wants you to be the best friend of their child. So you really cannot afford to screw up. You're also expected to have a lot of answers. I had, as a teenager, before, even my early preteen years, but especially as a teenager, I had a lot of adults in the church come to me and ask me about theological ideas. These are the people I'm supposed to learn from, but they would come to me and ask me for these complicated responses. So you kind of get this feeling like you have to understand and know everything in order to answer their questions. So, they'd always be ready to give a reason for your faith element comes in. You study up, you read a lot. When I was 16, I got my driver's license. The very first thing I did was drive to the Christian bookstore and buy a book on hermeneutics. For those of you who don't know, that's a book about methods for interpreting the Bible and interpreting any text really, but when it comes to a Christian bookstore, it's about the Bible. And so you have a lot of that. So I read voraciously. I was constantly updating my theology, trying to find a way to improve it, and that often meant, even as a teenager, moving away from the sort of dispensationalist, Left Behind series type theology to something more mainstream, that sort of thing. And so I ended up doing all that. And as I grew up and left the house, went to Chicago, went to Philadelphia, went to Birmingham, Alabama, I took those opportunities to, well, you know how it is. When you're young with your family, you sort of play the game, right? But then when you get away from the house, you go off and do the things you've always wanted to do. And for a pastor's kid in a conservative church, that's not really about partying or all the things that I missed out on when I was a teenager. It's really about visiting different denominations and trying to see if you fit somewhere else. So, you went from this conservative Baptist to Reformed Baptist to Orthodox Presbyterian to Presbyterian Church USA to Presbyterian Church America to Presbyterian Church USA, eventually landing in the Episcopal Church. Now, for my family, that was a traumatic thing. I was still in the faith. For them, by becoming Episcopal, I was almost Catholic, which is almost the same as being not in the faith at all. So it doesn't really, for me, it was an expression of honesty. I realized I was moving. I wanted the place I was going to be at to represent that. For them, it was watching me progressively become this liberal. But of course, I fortunately have a great family. They don't make that an issue with me in the way that some families have for some people I know. So I made all these particular changes, and it was at the Episcopal Church that I was at before I left entirely. Life as a student, I would say it's really hard for me to pinpoint where things went south in terms of how my family would view it, and where I was starting to really question everything. But I would say that my time as a student, I was at 3 evangelical schools, and there was not a point in which I wasn't making some significant intellectual change somewhere in being in those schools. Each one of those gave me a new perspective. I remember one time when I was at Trinity, a professor of mine, very conservative man, patriarchal in his worldview. You might know Wayne Grudem.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So a professor of mine said, he was talking about the new heavens and the new earth, which for Christian theology is sort of this end point of everything. Depending upon your way of looking at the end of the world, it's the final eternal place where God creates this new heaven and a new earth. And he was really looking forward to the new heaven and new earth because he was hoping that he could eventually get back to snowboarding. He thought that this new heaven and new earth was going to have all of the things that we love about this place without all the downfalls of, dying, and falling off your snowboard, going off a cliff and having the fear of death. So you want to get back to snowboarding and skiing and this kind of thing. And then some student says something in the class, do you really think that's going to happen? And he said, here's the thing. He said, I know it sounds weird, but ask yourself, like, when you hear Mormon beliefs and when you hear Muslim beliefs, how foreign does that sound? How strange does that sound to your ears? And I'm like, well, it sounds pretty strange. And I mean, all of you have experienced probably it doesn't really matter who you are. At some point, you've talked to somebody who has a belief that you think is kind of weird and out there. He said, now think about your faith. You have a God who was both God, fully divine, fully human, who died and was resurrected from the dead. You believe in there's a devil, there's a hell, there's a heaven. You start going through the litany of things that Christians believe. He said, now think about how that sounds to the ears of somebody else. Now for him, this was a way of justifying snowboarding in the afterlife. For me, this question never left me. So I've always imagined that ancient Christians were probably looked at by ancient Jews the same way early Mormons were looked at by modern Christians. So Christians add a new sacred text. Mormons add a new sacred text. So there's a sense in which when you start thinking about phenomenologically, you start thinking about how somebody else experiences life and how they might perceive you, it starts to take the microscope and flip it around. K.L. Noll, this professor, deals with religious studies, wrote an article for the Chronicle of Higher Education in which he said that the religious studies professor should be like the scientist in the lab. So for the religious studies professor, the religious studies professor is to the theologian as the scientist is to the frog. So that you start to take the religious studies that you're studying, and it becomes an academic process where you take the theologian, you put the theologian under the microscope, and you study that theologian, and you start to find out where all the biases are at, these kinds of things, and much like you would do with a frog. And with that professor's statement to me about how somebody else might think about my faith, I felt like the microscope flipped around, and now I was under it. And I know what he intended by that, but I would say that since my time at that point, I started asking that question over and over again. Now, I watched a lot of controversies at Moody. There was a dispute between classic dispensationalists and progressive dispensationalists. Really, it's like, do you want to buy your spaghetti sauce with or without meat? I mean, it's kind of a very minor difference unless you're vegetarian. And so the fine points were pretty strong for them. They were pretty much infighting. Professors would walk to each other's doors, put cartoons that said something about the other person on their door, and messages, and say comments in classrooms about the other professors and these kinds of things. The rest of the world paid no attention to this because why would you? It's not really, important. It doesn't really it doesn't really affect anything. But for them, it was this controversy was everything. I went from there to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and while I was there, my professor was involved in evangelicals and Catholics together. My advisor, which was John Woodbridge, and I watched him get raked over the coals by other Christians for wanting to talk about having peace with other Christians. How can we as evangelicals get along with you as Catholics? It sounds like, if you're going to be Christian, right, wouldn't it be nice if you were just the kind of Christian that was actually getting along with other Christians? That you weren't kind of a jerk all the time? Apparently that was too much to ask. So I watched him get raked over the coals. And then I went to Westminster Theological Seminary, and I watched a professor there who was my professor, Peter Enns. You can look up his controversy online. It was everywhere. Wrote a book called Inspiration and Incarnation, and it's about the Bible and why it looks the way it looks. Why does it look like such an ancient document? And it's because the Bible actually is. It lives and breathes the culture in which it was written. No, it's not a science book. Yes, Moses borrows from the Code of Hammurabi, these kinds of things. And at a conservative Presbyterian school that was undergoing a major cultural shift. This resulted in him eventually being pushed out over it. Now, why I say this in relationship to what I saw at Trinity about how do you look to other people. Now, what I saw there was, I looked at these controversies at all these schools I've been at, and I saw how professors repeatedly over the years have been pushed out over doctrine, over ideas, over minutia of theological detail. So that it's really hard if you're especially in a conservative evangelical school. Now, honestly, some Catholic universities have a lot more freedom than evangelical schools, to be honest. But how does that look to the outside world? To see these people like being fired and losing their jobs, the things that provide insurance and health insurance, the things that provide a roof over their families' heads. How does it look? What do these Christians look like that are willing to do this to other Christians? Well, they look like bad guys. And with that microscope approach, I had to ask myself the question, when I get frustrated by watching these Christians fight each other and push each other out over doctrine in the seminary world, is it because, is it because they're doing something that I shouldn't expect, or is it because I'm just a different kind of person? In other words, if I were to look at Christianity and it was a pharmaceutical, okay? Christians tell me that when you're converted and you're regenerated, you're going to be a better person. You will be, in fact, given new eyes. You'll be able to see the light. You'll be able to live according to the righteous way that God wants you to live. Now, if that was a pharmaceutical, that was the claim of the pharmaceutical. If it was a drug that I could take, that was the claim of it. And then they did studies on it, and it turns out that, only half the time maybe people live the way they're supposed to, and half the time they don't. And in fact, you might even say 70% of the time they're doing things they shouldn't do. In other words, if it was a drug that claimed to cure my illness, I would never take it, because it actually does not accomplish what it sets out to accomplish. What does that say about my faith? What does that say about me? It says that human beings are human beings. Christians are just human beings. There's no supernatural change there. So as I'm going through my life with the high expectations of a pastor's kid, I'm going through seminary world with these expectations of what it means to be a Christian. What I see instead are people that just act like people. And what I see is a faith that looks pretty much like any normal faith. We end up reading the Bible, we end up discovering things in the seminary, like how much it looks like the ancient Babylonian text, how much it reflects the Mesopotamian region, these kinds of things. If I were to take my faith and treat it then like I would treat any other faith that I would reject normally, if I were to subject my faith to the same test that I would do any other faith, it would look like it doesn't withstand the test of logic, and it doesn't withstand the test of evidence. Now, over time, you get those bits and pieces of things that challenge your faith, and you can reason some of them away. But at some point, when you're a seminary professor, and you've experienced this many times over the years, and you have to do things like course prep, and you have to do things like, in a seminary world, for example, you have to, you're not just, my field is religious history. I'm an historian. But I'm expected in the seminary world to be a theological advocate. That means that in teaching, I have to be able to say the things that are going to reinforce the faith of my students. It's very difficult to do. When you spend your life thinking about whether your faith withstands the test of evidence the way other faiths do not, where if I were to say, where are the tablets for Mormonism? They don't exist. I can come up, I know Mormons that have come up with any number of explanations as to why they don't exist. To me, when I was in the evangelical world, that sounds like you're just equivocating, you're coming up with excuses. But what about the original manuscripts of the Bible? How do I know for a fact that so-and-so wrote this particular text? So when you flip it around, when you study the faith, you start to see that the evidence doesn't seem to match what you originally thought of the Bible. and you see that people really don't act differently, even though they've been supposedly transformed and made into new creatures. You start to ask these questions of yourself, and when you're in the seminary world, that's when the tension starts to snap. So what do you do when you're up in front of a classroom and your student says, what was God doing in the Protestant Reformation? What was God doing during the First or Second Great Awakening? And you're already to the point where you're not sure there's even a God. So in a seminary world, you're expected to be an advocate, you're expected to be an adherent of a faith, you're expected to be there to reinforce the faith ideas of other people. And at some point, you reach that breaking point where you realize you can't do that, and you have to make a decision. For me, a couple years ago, I was sitting down trying to figure out a way to come up with a good theological response to the problem of entropy, as one does. And I was sitting there looking through some things, and I was toying with a bunch of philosophical responses that deal with this long-lasting question of personal identity and how you can be the same person at 80 years old and the same person at birth, but not share almost any single cell with your original self. So what happens when the universe is experiencing this sort of heat death? And it goes. So I was going through this entire thing. I was like, okay, I got this great response, and then I just stopped, and I just thought to myself, now I'm just making stuff up. Now I'm just making stuff up. But I recalled all the times in which my faith was challenged at Moody, at Trinity, at Westminster, where I watched professors trying to come up with good responses so they can keep their faith and be true to be good academics, because a lot of them they're Harvard graduates and Yale graduates. I mean, these are not dumb guys. They want to be true to their faith, but they also want to be true to their academic life. That's really difficult. As I watched them do all this, I thought to myself, you know what? They're just doing the same thing I'm doing right here. They're trying to come up with a theological response. Well, why are some Christians good and why are some Christians bad? Well, sometimes people fall into sin. Or maybe sometimes people are just jerks. And so why is the Bible, why does it look like it does? Why does it look like Moses is taken from the Code of Hammurabi, for example? Well, you could come up with this really complicated response. You could say the Bible is incarnational. It's both fully divine and fully human. Therefore, while it's inspired by God, it's going to look and smell like a human being. It's going to have the human language, culture, and context. But is that just not a way to look past the fact that the Bible is just like an ancient book, that it borrows from the people around it, and it's no more divine than, say, the Canaanite literature? So I'm looking at this great thing I'm trying to do to come up with a way to respond to the issue of entropy, and I think I'm just making stuff up. I open up a Microsoft Word document and I type out, I'm either a deist, an agnostic, or an atheist. And that was the first time I'd ever acknowledged that to myself. I didn't type this part out, but what I also realized is it doesn't really matter, because any one of those answers means I'm out of a job. But having moved from being a conservative all the way through all these different denominations and having changed a lot, I decided I was going to give myself time to figure things out. Nobody's going to die if I just take a little while to make sure of where I'm at before I stand firm on something.
Why would deism have been just as problematic as atheism or agnosticism?
Because for deism, you have a God who, the sort of simplistic way of talking about deism is you have a God who creates the universe according to the laws of physics and then just sort of like winds up the clock and lets it go. Doesn't get involved. But for Christianity, especially evangelical Christianity, you have a God who's very involved in your faith. So a deist God is not truly a Christian God. Now, you had some early... So if you go back about early 18th century, was you're approaching into some major Enlightenment thinkers. You have some deists who are essentially Christian deists. They are culturally Christian. They affirm certain things about Christianity, but for all intents and purposes, they are deists. God does not get involved. Reason is the superior thing instead of trusting in miracles and supernaturalism and stuff like that. So deism does have this sort of spectrum of belief, but deism itself is something in which you have a God who's not involved in things. Now, it can resolve a lot of theological tension if, for example, you have trouble acknowledging miracles. You can say, well, maybe God just doesn't do miracles because he's not involved in anything. But if you're a Christian, you have to you have to affirm things, especially an evangelical Christian, you have to affirm things like the virgin birth. You have to affirm things like miracles, the resurrection from the dead. That stuff doesn't happen unless you have a God that's involved. So deism is still problematic. In the seminary world, there are a few theological schools out there, few divinity schools that do not have a certain theological criteria that you have to assent to. They are generally not the prominent thing out there. So if you're in a seminary world, there's usually a confession or creed or statement of faith that you have to sign on to. And for most Christianity, mainline Protestantism, for Catholic schools, there are certain doctrines you just cannot ignore. And deism usually makes that impossible. You can't be a deist and not embrace, you have to be, if you're a deist, you can't embrace certain things. So that is problematic. But I know a lot of seminary professors that pretty much confess their faith, but also pretty much, the way they work on a daily basis, they think and act more like deists. So I thought deism was a possibility, atheism, agnosticism, looking at the sort of spectrum of belief or disbelief. And I gave myself time to do that. Eventually, I came to conclude that I would, my primary identifier is secular humanist. Came to look at myself as an atheist. And I was about to give my notice at Weinbrenner because that is clearly problematic in an evangelical institution. And right at the time I was really kind of making these conclusions about things and trying to settle on how I wanted to describe myself. We were losing a professor. We were in the middle of accreditation. I had all these people that I was responsible to. Also, those were all great excuses to not leave right away. I readily admit those are probably things I was feeding myself again to keep myself there. But I wanted to do the right thing by the community. And then January 2014, I had a blog one time called The Discarded Image. It's still up. Right now my main blog is The Curious Ape because I needed to shift the theme. But I wrote about ancient Near Eastern beliefs and the original Adam and the snake in the garden, and the connection to Babylonian myth, these kinds of things, which resulted in a lot of donors being angry and calling, board members and these kinds of things, saying basically they wouldn't give to the school if I was still there. Now, here's the thing. That might sound like Weinbrenner would be really furious with me for rejecting an original Adam and not reading Genesis literally, especially with the school that is pretty much a very conservative school. But the dean and everybody that was in charge of making that decision said, no, we respect your academic freedom. That by itself doesn't usually match what you see in the news about how schools react. And that was pretty, to their credit, a very strong thing. The academic dean, former military guy, about as honorable as they come. And he didn't know that behind all of that was my struggle with maintaining any sort of faith and that I was basically on my way out. So instead of having him rue the day that he defended me, and I had just written Consider No Evil, Two Faith Traditions and the Problem of Academic Freedom and Religious Higher Education, which came out in 2014. Menachem and I wrote it based on our two experiences, he growing up in an Orthodox Jewish household, me growing up in a conservative evangelical household. So I just written that. I just looked at all these test cases of faculty that lost their jobs because of what they taught and thought and these kinds of things. And I watched over and over again in all these different cases that I was looking at for this book, how the communities were just ripped apart. And really nobody won in any of those battles, ever. But also knowing where I was at. I mean, these are people that were still in the faith and they had these things happen to them. And I knew where I was at. So I just said, well, thanks for this. And then the next day I emailed them and said, we need to talk again. And I gave them my resignation letter. To their credit, I said, yes, so what is it you don't believe anymore? And I said, well, none of it. And I said, and you guys you and the associate dean, I said, you're really good people. You're my friends. And the last thing I want to do is to be that guy that destroys people's friendships and stuff over this. Because the real problem was not the school, it was me. I mean, ultimately, seminaries are places for training for ministry. They're not universities. At a university, you have departments, you have different fields. Sciences, humanities, these kinds of things. You have people studying psychology, you have people studying nuclear medicine, you have people studying pharmacology, and history and religious studies and all that kind of thing. In this seminary, you don't have all those departments. You have a theology department, you have a counseling department, which is basically psychology, and you have a history department, practical theology, something like that. You don't really have all these vast departments because the purpose of the school is to produce more like-minded Christians. Even though you want to make sure that they have a broader view, a lot of seminaries are just like, no, we want to make sure you understand that there are a lot of Christians who don't agree on things and try to be very ecumenical about it. Ultimately, you're there to produce more Christians, and you're there to help their faith. So the seminary is not going to become a school for the study of secular humanism. So the problem was me in that situation, not theirs. So I gave my resignation, and to their credit, they let me teach all the way through July for 2 more semesters to fill out my contract, and because I just gave my word that I wasn't going to cause any problems while I was there. And they trusted me on that. I think because I just was honest with them about the other stuff. But my story, that kind of a breakup, I just had dinner with 2 colleagues, former colleagues from the school, chatted like, as friends. But that's not the normal story by any stretch. Most people are going to lose their jobs and be pushed out of positions, and they're not even going to have gone as far as I have. They're simply going to say, yeah, evolution is possible. They might even say human beings were created as they are, but evolution is true in terms of all the other species on this planet, and still lose their faculty position, even though their field is just history and really has no real theological bearing. So my situation was different in where I ended up, and I can tell you, I'm not the only faculty person who has these doubts. There are other Christian faculty out there that have said to me that they are heading into that direction, but they have families and mortgages, and that's really rough. So I direct them to things like the Clergy Project and stuff like that.
I was wondering, how do they in these seminaries deal with such open thinkers like Weinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich? Because I've read some of their work, and they're very open-minded.
In your very liberal schools, things like I said, like things like evolution, most of the things that you hear about as causing controversies really aren't a controversy. And in fact, if you're a young Earth creationist in some liberal seminaries, you're kind of the one that might be looking to lose your job. So that's the kind of thing that I think is just kind of difficult, because this is why I say, like, there are times where I want to get angry and just like label everybody into this one big broad brush, but it's really not easy to do. But if you're a curious enough person, you're going to bump into some problems. So in those situations, you might have somebody who has a more pantheistic deity. And that particular person then still believes in a God. And if the school's liberal enough, that might be the only statement of faith you need to assent to. But I would say that in most seminary situations, aside from the sort of oddball places out there, most seminary situations, you still have to at least assent to the idea of a deity. So there will be a point in which you will be finding your way out if you have moved as far as I have moved. So, yeah. So this is the thing. Curiosity kills a seminary faculty position when you're the kind of person who wants to follow the evidence no matter where it leads, and you eventually find that evidence leading you out the door. But the reason why you can walk up to somebody, a seminary faculty member, seminary student, somebody in the church, and you can say, "Why are you still Christian? Can't you see X?" And you might throw some bit of fact at them. And then they go, "Well, I don't have a problem with that," or "I do have a problem with it, but I see it this way or that way." The reason why they don't immediately agree with you is because we are all capable of taking these biases and creating a sort of environment that shields our faith and allows us to either accept new ideas or to protect ourselves from them. So that is why you can have in a seminary world, you can have, I was reading books at Moody, books about higher criticism, about the different things that biblical studies professors and specialists have talked about in terms of editing in the Bible and evidence of multiple authors and evidence that Moses is not the author. They didn't shield us from those books, and I think some people think that there's this bubble where you're in those schools that you're shielded from that, and you're not really. You're just taught. Again, the questions aren't the problem. You're taught what the answer should be once you've read those books. But if that answer doesn't really match the evidence, and you're the kind of person who leads that evidence and follows that evidence, you can eventually find your way out. So I don't know. I mean, is it surprising to you that as somebody like myself would have to leave my job? Okay. I have had some people that have said to me, "Why did you even have to leave your job?" And I think there's probably more of a cultural question in terms of trying to understand seminaries. I'll start here first.
What I find surprising is I was expecting you to say, "Oh, well, like a year before I left, I started being approached by colleagues saying, oh, we're a little concerned with your faith. We noticed you said this and that, and we're worried about you." And I only remember you saying like the one time from your blog that something like that happened. So
there were, I would say, that was the big one. There was a time where when I was starting to get I first was looking to get I moved up there from adjunct to lecturer to all this stuff. I was moving into a permanent position. I was asked about how I understood science, things that deal with Genesis and all that, from one faculty member. The rest of the faculty were like, we don't care. One professor came to me and said, he was in a prominent position at the time, and he said, I don't really think Moses knew everything. I don't think he really knew everything he was talking about. This is in a school that's still largely, like a majority of the student body is conservative. So they had their own questions and stuff like that. So one faculty member then, and then I had a couple times, brief moments. One time I had required Dermot McCullough's book on the history of Christianity. And if you really want to read a fantastic volume on the history of Christianity, to just sort of immerse yourself in all the details, his book, the first 3,000 years or whatever, it's got two different titles depending on its UK and American title. It's a fantastic book. He's an excellent scholar, and he happens to be gay.
What was that book again?
It's Christianity, I think the American title is First 2,000 Years. So it's an excellent book. He's fantastic. I know he does well with the sources because he cites one of my chapters in the book. So a little bit of bias there. But so I require this, and then my students look up the author, and they find out he's gay. And I had a mutiny on my hands. Called to the dean's office. They went to the board, they went to the president, and the dean said, well, no, we basically agreed that you don't ask if your bus driver is, straight before you get on and have them take you to the next location. What does this have? In other words, what does this sexuality have to do with whether he's a good historian or not? So they defended me again, to their credit. And nobody put me on the grill to say, what do you think about gay marriage or anything like that? Nothing like that. So Weinberger is not typical in that way. Obviously, I reached a point where they would have had to say, "Oh, okay, you've gone too far." So I headed that off by talking to them about it. But yeah, there wasn't a lot of that. And in fact, we had ELCA people. Even though the denomination is Churches of God General Conference, we had ELCA people, Evangelical Lutheran Church. We had people, so we had Evangelical Lutherans, we had Presbyterians, PCUSA, Presbyterian Church of the United States. We had plenty, because you kind of have to have Churches of God people teaching at the seminary for Churches of God, or else people stop donating. But we had some diversity in the faculty here and there, but the overall denomination, highly conservative, the student body, highly conservative, several of the faculty members, still, that was the point, which... something about when you say things like there was no such thing as a talking snake in Genesis that tends to get under the skin of a few people. But, yeah.
Or you maybe somehow becoming or choosing to become, I will use the word threat, but a threat from the outside versus a threat from the inside. If somebody stays in and questions, if you have a Marcus Board type person in your seminary faculty that is just ripping Christianity a new a-hole and
Yeah.
everything.
He's got that reputation,
Just
yeah.
done. I mean, just denying everything. And Spong, too, is another Christian writer. That is definitely more of a threat to a seminary or to the education system than someone who just, like you did, saying, this is bunk, I'm out. And then that's why you get that backlash, because it's like, oh, he went away.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was trying to avoid, honestly, because there are some people that see their denomination heading in a more liberal direction and really are there because they believe they're lifelong people that are part of the particular denomination, and they want to bring their denomination into the modern world and advance it and stuff like that. So they are there. I was not raised Churches of God, so I also didn't have that tied to the denomination. I was already kind of an outsider when I came in, because that was my first connection really to it to begin with. I think you can be seen as a threat. I mean, here's the way somebody might view me now. From my own tradition, somebody would say I was never truly a Christian. Now, that would be because they would say that if you were truly a Christian, you would have been regenerated by the Holy Spirit. You would have had faith, and God would have, you would have been sanctified by the Spirit and been made a better person and stuff. You would have never abandoned your faith in that way. So I was a faker, a sheep's and wolf's clothing, or just somebody who was in the church, not a bad guy, loves people and really wanted to do the right thing, but this is his family background, but he just discovered that it wasn't for him. I would say that probably based on some of the messages I got on Facebook, so a lot of people were shocked, so they would have never thought of me that way. So that's one way of saying it. You're not really a Christian. That means that when I'm in a seminary, like Weinberger, for some of those people that would say that, that would mean that I was that sort of like a threat from within kind of thing. Now, Weinberger has a background that is Arminian, which means that they come from the tradition of Jacob of Arminius, which has this emphasis on the ability to lose one's salvation. So you can be a Christian, a true Christian, but the devil can snare you, and then you could lose your salvation, lose your faith. So you weren't really an internal threat or a sheep in wolf's clothing. You just became, something that you were pulled out of the church by Satan.
Is that kind of similar to the Baptist concept of backsliding?
It is, except for backsliding in much of the Baptist world, at least the Baptist world that I was raised in. Backsliding can be something akin to, because a lot of Baptist Christians don't believe that the only change that happens is progressively good. So you can fall back into old sins and stuff like that, and then become more like your old self. But if you're really a Christian, eventually you're going to come back around. God's going to work in you to make you come back. Difference with that and this is that you could lose your salvation entirely, meaning you had it, you slid away, but also you no longer have it. You're either now to the point where you're unsavable, or something's got to happen to transform you significantly to bring you back.
So I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Feel free to deny me if you need to.
Okay.
So you talked about like some of your internal struggles with your faith,
Mm-hmm.
And about your professional struggles.
Mm-hmm.
How did these struggles collide or intersect with your personal life?
Well, so one of the slides I had on here was somebody asks, why do you not leave your faith? Why didn't you leave your job earlier? And my family, my job, everything about I have 9 books published from evangelical publishers. Everything about my entire life and my job were intertwined. It was entangled. So I was raised in the church. I'm a pastor's kid. I was teaching and preaching from the pulpit in my early teen years, participating in the music on occasion, all this kind of stuff. Going off to 3 evangelical schools, I didn't do that just because it was like, somebody offered me a scholarship. It was because this is who I was. This was so much a part of me that I couldn't see the world outside of wanting to be the best theologian that you could craft. The one that could come up with the best answers and responses to everything. So then I did a bachelor's in theology with a Greek emphasis. But I loved history in high school, so by the time I finished that, I realized I really loved history more than anything else. So I went off and did history of Christian thought, and I did historical and theological studies. History of Christianity was my actual field, early modern. But the theme is this: everything I did, every degree I did, every job I sought had something to do with faith. It was so much a part of my life, so entangled that there's every book I bought from my library had something to do with trying to figure things out with my faith. Every person I went to conferences. Everything I did was in service to the church. There really wasn't, another world for me at the time. But also, I'm not the kind of person who can ignore good points when somebody makes them. So when you actually read a book that challenges you, sort of like, what do I do with that? So my job, the academy itself, was very much, I wouldn't have been in the seminary world if it wasn't for the fact that I was raised in the church, for me. Now, for other people, that can be different reasons why you're in the seminary world. But for me, it's because in my job, my career, my faith, my family, all of it was intertwined. But the more of an academic I became, the less of an adherent I stayed. So the more I studied as an academic, the more I was able to put myself under the microscope and put religion and study the theologian like the way the scientist studies the frog. The more I did that, the less I was confirmed as a, in what I believed about my faith. It was, yeah.
So I'm although you studied in conservative seminaries and theological schools and whatever, I feel like you nevertheless would have a good read on liberal Christianity. So I'm of two minds about liberal Christianity, which I'm hoping you can speak to.
Okay.
On the one hand, I feel like when I encounter liberal Christianity politically and kind of culturally, they're for all the things that I'm for. And they're doing really useful things to make a better world and a better society.
Sure, yeah.
On the other hand, when I encounter it intellectually, I get kind of frustrated because sometimes I feel like the liberal clergy are just being slick. Because, if an atheist, not a Christian atheist or a Jewish atheist, but an atheist, debates a liberal pastor, it's like any point the atheist makes, the liberal pastor could just say, oh, I don't really believe that. That's just metaphor. Are they just being slick or what?
I have this theme that I think, when I think about how people view themselves in the world, for example, I won't use the word they're teaching lies or they're liars frequently, because I don't think most people see themselves as being liars, to be honest. I think that's unhelpful because it's really not getting at the problem to begin with. And it can be thrown around in it's a word that's almost meaningless. I do see that I think that everyone is the hero of their own story. So I do think that what they see themselves as doing is trying to craft a faith that really meets the demands of modern questions. And there's a thing about being in the academy, even from the Episcopal Church that I was in to my friends that teach at liberal seminaries or liberal Christian schools, universities, and colleges. That at some point you see all this stuff, you realize that there are connections in the ancient Near Eastern world to the Old Testament, these kinds of things, and you think, well, I can't imagine the world is not being created by God. So God must have some reason why He used all of this to spread a message. You might say that the Bible is sort of just like a record of human experiences of trying to seek out God. But I don't think they sit down and they go, how can I dodge a question today? I just don't think that. I think most of those answers are legitimately how someone feels. I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. Or it's a metaphor, or it's allegory. And I think you can get so immersed in that kind of thinking that, the discontinuities don't stand out to you. You just don't see them. I knew someone whose wife had an affair, and she ended up having another man's baby. And it was clear and evident to all of us that this was not his child. He and his parents, when they looked at the baby, they only pointed out all of the features that looked like it could be him. Well, look, the baby has kind of like his fingers. Didn't he have fingers like that when he was little? Yeah, the baby has this similar color hair. Look at that nose. Turned out he was not in that baby at all.
Was it a virgin birth?
No. She had an affair, and it was somebody else's child. But they wanted to believe it enough that they were looking for the evidence that confirmed that for them. Now, were they going, how can I trick myself? No. The human mind is capable of crafting any number of stories that are needed to make it through the day.
A long time ago, the first people crafted those first stories to make it through the day, and everybody evolved those stories to become all the world's religions.
Yeah,
Almost that simple.
You can watch the progression of thought. So I'm working on a book right now, which is partly why if you go to my blog, you're going to find that I ditched for a couple weeks because I've been in writing mode. But ancient Near Eastern world, the idea of hell, for example, didn't start as a way to control people. People started burying people, probably initially with some sense of getting rid of the smell. But also then they started asking questions, where does that person go? And as they would look up into the sky and they would see the universe, they had crafted stories to explain that. Now they had to explain what happens to life after you're dead. And we talked about these things like the underworld, and the Babylonian underworld, the Mesopotamian underworld was just more of a storage facility for people. They kind of just hung out. It was kind of boring. There was no real torture going on initially. But then we can watch, by the time you get to the Egyptians, the underworld becomes a place of actual punishment. It goes from what's called a neutral underworld to a moral underworld. So now you have an underworld that becomes punishment for people who do wrong things. And so now you have to craft stories about how to avoid that punishment. So you have the Book of the Dead, for example, and these kinds of things. But those things, when you go to the ancient pharaoh temple pyramids, all those stories about how to avoid, to make it through the underworld, are painted on the ceilings and the walls of those pyramids to help them through the different gates and stuff like that. The average person, everyday person, didn't have access to that information. So it became, eventually, if you want people to live a moral life, including the people that aren't the rich and leaders of Egypt, you have to give access to them. Give them access to how to live a good moral life and the things to avoid in the afterlife. Things start to build up, stories start to get more complicated. They go from just a neutral death to a moral death to a sophisticated Dante's multi-circles and circles within circles and these kinds of things. We always complicate things. We always create stories. We create stories so that we can try to explain how to live, what to expect, how to deal with people, that kind of stuff. It's a very human thing to do, whether you're trying to affirm that this is indeed your child, or whether you're trying to affirm that you're not wasting your life in the church, or if you want to have something that helps define who you are and gives you purpose. So, long way of saying that I do think, a lot of ancient people do have crafted this stuff initially, but we're capable of doing that on an individual basis too and making it our own.
So you mentioned meeting up with some of your former colleagues after you had left the seminary. So what do they have to say about your leaving and your lack of faith, or was it an elephant in the room that was just not discussed, or?
No, I mean, we've talked about it. One person, she told me that some people were asking how I was doing, and she said, I think he's the happiest he's been in a long time. And she didn't say it like the happiest, like, darn it, I wish he was still, So no, we have those initial conversations where it's like catching up. How's the seminary doing? That kind of stuff. But fortunately, but when you talk about liberal Christians and stuff like that, fortunately, they kind of fall into that spectrum. And in their place in that conservative world, they're sort of the liberals. And so we actually still have stuff in common. And we find things. You have work friends, and then when you leave your job, you never talk to that person again. And it's awkward if they show up on Facebook. But sometimes you might find somebody that, like the one or two people that you still manage to keep in touch with because you had other things in common. That's what I've set out to do with them. So, yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Has anybody, during the time that you still thought you believed in God, ever asked you, well, where did God come from?
No. That's always a good question to ask. I think there's this, when Thomas Aquinas deals with the immovable mover, he says, he talks about things, having we know that natural things have a beginning. Children have parents, parents have parents, and things have an end, a natural end where they die. So there's causes that are involved in the progression of life. For things to happen, there has to be a cause. But if you go far enough back, that you eventually run into the immovable mover. There has to be something that caused all of it that didn't need a first cause. And then Thomas has this line in the Summa there, he says, and everybody calls that God. He just assumes that everybody's going to call that God, and everybody's going to be fine with that. He's an Aristotelian. Aristotle wouldn't have said it, but that is something he would say. And I think there's just a lot of people that, everything has a cause, everything has a beginning. But why would God need a beginning? That's just not something that people really even think about, honestly. You can bring it up to them. It can be a question for somebody, that might cause some difficulty. But I think for a lot of them, it's just like, well, he's immortal, invisible. Therefore, there's no start. Yeah. Okay, I think that's everything.
All right, thank you very much.